My name is Dr. Aaron Beck. I've been a psychiatrist for over 25 years, most of them spent in the echoing corridors of Cedars-Sinai Medical Center here in Los Angeles. In that time, I've treated every shade of the human mind, from quiet sadness to the kind of madness that makes you question your own reflection. But this is the one case I could never quite close. It's about a man named Daniel Kepler, a patient who arrived one night covered in blood that wasn't his, and left me with questions I'll carry until my last breath. It was nearly midnight when the call came. The psychiatric emergency unit was restless, a low, buzzing tension you could almost taste in the air. The kind of night when every conversation is whispered, every footstep feels louder than it should. They had him sitting in the far corner of the observation room, hands folded in his lap as though he were waiting for a bus. His posture was immaculate, back straight, chin slightly lowered, eyes half hidden in shadow. But what struck me wasn't his stillness. It was the way he seemed to know the room. His gaze drifting precisely to each nurse as they moved, as if their motions were rehearsed lines in a play he'd already seen. When I stepped in, Nurse Holloway leaned toward me, her voice barely a breath. He knew my name. I never told him. Her face was pale, lips pressed tight. I didn't answer her. Not yet. The LAPD officers who'd brought him in were still by the door, shifting their weight like they wanted to be anywhere else. I glanced at the intake notes, found wandering near the 6th Street Bridge, 3:04 a.m. covered in someone else's blood. No ID. No resistance during arrest. The patient's clothes were a strange detail in themselves. Not rags, not formal wear, just clean, neutral garments, except for the stains. But beneath the coppery scent of dried blood, I caught something else. The faint, acrid tang of burned metal. I approached slowly, taking him in piece by piece. The minute twitch in his left index finger, the almost imperceptible rise and fall of his breathing, the way his gaze slid over me without landing. Daniel, I said, testing the name they'd given him after he refused to identify himself. No reaction. I'm Dr. Beck. I'm here to talk with you. That's all. For a long time, nothing. Just the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Then, without moving his head, his eyes found mine and held them. There was no defiance in that look, no fear. Only recognition. It was the kind of recognition that doesn't make sense. The way you might look at someone you've dreamt about but never met. I sat across from him, tried a dozen opening gambits, asked about the bridge, the blood, his injuries, or lack thereof. Not a word. He didn't fidget, didn't avert his eyes. The silence was a wall, and he had no intention of letting me climb it. Behind me, I could hear the quiet murmur of the nurses. He's been like that for hours. Doesn't even blink unless you're looking. I kept my tone even, my posture relaxed. The more I looked, the more it felt as though he was studying me far more closely than I was studying him. Like I was the one under evaluation. When I finally stood to leave, something happened, so small it could have been missed. His lips moved. Not a sound, just the barest shaping of words. I couldn't read them, but the intent was there, almost taunting. As I stepped back into the hallway, Nurse Holloway caught my arm. "What's wrong with him?" I told her the truth. "I don't know." But as I glanced back through the glass, his eyes were still on me, unblinking. And in that moment, I had the sudden, disquieting sense that I just stepped into something I wouldn't be able to step out of. By morning, the lab results had arrived. I read them twice, then a third time, as though repetition might make them less improbable. The blood saturating his clothes, deep into the seams and fibers, belonged to 3 different people. 3 distinct DNA profiles. None of them matched our patient, and none were listed in any hospital database as injured, admitted, or even missing. It was like they'd been pulled from ghosts. Daniel, the name we still used in absence of a real one, remained in the same chair. He hadn't moved much through the night. A nurse swore she'd seen him asleep at one point, but the more I looked at him, the less I believed he needed rest the way most people did. I sat across from him again. This time, I didn't bother with formalities. 3 different people's blood, I said. Not yours. That's unusual, Daniel. For a long moment, There was nothing but the soft hiss of the air vent. Then, so quietly I thought I'd imagined it, I heard him speak. "They'll come for me here, too." It was the first sound he'd made since arriving. A phrase without context, delivered in a voice calm enough to be terrifying. "Who will?" I asked, leaning forward. He only blinked, slow and deliberate, before letting his gaze drift to the corner of the ceiling, as if tracking something I couldn't see. Rational explanations rattled through my head like loose coins. Dissociative fugue, trauma-induced mutism, severe PTSD. But each of those diagnoses had a shape, a pattern. And he didn't fit any of them. My colleagues had less patience for mystery. "Transfer him to a secure ward," Dr. Sloan insisted during rounds. "Sedate if necessary. He's a disruption to the staff." I shook my head. "I want him close." The truth was, I'd felt a shift. A faint, almost imperceptible rhythm in the way he moved his hands, tilted his head, or looked at people as they spoke. It wasn't random. It was more like signaling. Later that day, I caught him watching the reflection of the nurses in the observation window. His eyes weren't on their faces, but on the badges clipped to their uniforms, each one with a name, as though he were memorizing them. By evening, the unit felt different. The bright, steady hum of fluorescent lights seemed to press inward, making the hallways narrower, the air thicker. People spoke more softly without meaning to. I passed a nurse in the corridor who muttered, "I swear he's waiting for something." I wanted to believe this was just the unit feeding off its own unease. But when I went back to see Daniel, I realized something that stopped me cold. He was smiling. It wasn't wide or mocking, just a faint curve of the lips, as if something he'd predicted was unfolding exactly as he expected. And I found myself thinking, against all my training, against all reason, maybe it was. The hospital at night is a different place. The daytime noise, the rolling gurneys, the clipped conversations, the chorus of monitors, fades into something quieter but heavier. It's a silence that carries weight. I was in my office, the glow of the monitor casting the only light, when I decided to review Daniel Kepler's file again. I don't know why. Maybe I thought a second look would reveal something I'd overlooked. It didn't. Instead, it revealed something worse. His file was gone. Not archived. Not misplaced in a shared folder. Completely gone from the Cedars-Sinai system. I refreshed the screen twice. On the third try, it appeared again, only this time, half the information was missing. The intake notes were stripped bare, the lab results erased, my own progress reports nowhere to be found. I called down to IT. They assured me our system was secure, no breach, no scheduled maintenance. But as they spoke, I caught a flicker on the screen, a cursor moving through the file, adding and deleting lines at inhuman speed. Then the timestamp changed, logging an edit at 2:14 a.m. No one was logged in at that time. Not me. Not IT. No one. My mind ran through possibilities. A glitch, a prank, an error in the metadata. But the truth was already rooting itself in my gut. This wasn't a malfunction. Someone, or something, didn't want this file intact. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior was shifting. The passivity that had marked his first days gave way to volatility. He could be eerily calm one moment, then thrash violently at the touch of a blood pressure cuff. During a late-night vitals check, a nurse tried to guide him back to bed. He resisted with such sudden force that she stumbled into the wall. That's when I stepped in. I put myself between them. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment, it felt like the rest of the world ceased to exist. "You can't cure me," he said, voice steady, almost gentle. "I'm not sick." The words landed harder than any outburst could have. They were precise, deliberate. A statement of fact, not an argument. And in that instant, I realized how dangerous a truth can be when it refuses to conform to what you know. Because if Daniel wasn't sick, then what exactly was I dealing with? Still, I couldn't walk away. If anything, I was more certain than ever. If I could break through whatever wall he'd built around himself, the truth would come spilling out. And that truth, whatever it was, might explain far more than just him. The storm came in hard that night, wind rattling against the windows, rain slanting sideways like it was trying to pierce the glass. Power flickered twice before the backup generators kicked in, bathing the halls in a sickly orange glow. Ward C felt like another world under emergency lighting. Shadows were deeper, corners sharper, every sound amplified by the hush. I made my way toward Daniel's room, the soles of my shoes sticking faintly against the damp tile from tracked-in rain. The security guard assigned to his door was gone. No note. No sign of where he'd gone. The door itself stood slightly ajar, a thin slice of dim light spilling into the hallway. Inside, Daniel was standing at the window. His hands rested lightly on the sill, his gaze fixed on the city beyond the rain-smeared glass. He didn't turn when I entered. "They're closer now," he murmured. His tone wasn't fearful. It was resigned, like someone reading the time from a clock they couldn't stop. Before I could ask, a sound rolled through the hallway, metallic scraping, slow and deliberate, like gurney wheels dragged over tile. But when I stepped back into the corridor, it was empty. The sound echoed, fading into the distance, yet no one was there. The air felt wrong, heavy, charged. My skin prickled as though every hair stood on end. "Nurse Holloway," I called into my radio. "Lock down Ward C. Now." The lockdown order was acknowledged, but in the chaos, the alarms, the flickering lights, I lost sight of Daniel. I stepped back into the room, and he was gone. Restraints still hung from the bed frame, fastened exactly as they had been. The rain-streaked window hadn't been opened, the door never closed, yet he'd vanished without a sound. We searched the ward. The nurses, the security team, even the on-call residents joined in. 15 minutes later, he was found, sitting on his bed, eyes half-lidded, as though he'd never moved at all. When we reviewed the security footage, the camera feed from his room was pure static for exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds, the same window during which he disappeared. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Long enough for something to happen. Short enough to leave no trace but questions. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I began to suspect that whatever had come closer that night might not have left. It was strange, standing on the bridge in daylight. The police report had stripped it down to cold facts, location of discovery, physical evidence noted. But in person, the air felt heavier, as if the structure itself remembered what had happened here. The concrete under my shoes was scuffed, faint grooves where someone had struggled. Near the eastern rail, there was a patch of asphalt darkened by fire, its edges charred and brittle, like an old wound that never quite healed. And then there were the markings. Crude, erratic lines etched into the steel guardrail in what looked like dried blood. The symbols didn't belong to any language I knew. They were chaotic but deliberate, as if written in haste by a steady hand. A shuffle behind me made me turn. An older man, unshaven, wrapped in layers of tattered coats despite the California sun, watched me from the shadow of a lamppost. His eyes were pale and watery, but not without sharpness. "You're here for the man," he said. His voice rasped like wind through rusted wire. "What man?" I asked, though I knew exactly. He gave a toothless smile. "The one who walked with 3 shadows. Only one was his own." I felt my jaw tighten. "What do you mean?" The man just shook his head, muttering something inaudible, before disappearing down the walkway. I stayed longer than I should have, tracing the shapes on the rail with my fingertips. That night, back at Cedars-Sinai, I carried the weight of those symbols into Daniel's room. He was sitting cross-legged on his bed, his eyes fixed on a scrap of paper. Without looking up, his pencil scratched in fast, jagged strokes. When he finally set it down, I saw them, the exact same symbols from the bridge. "Where did you see these?" I asked. Daniel's gaze was calm, almost pitying. "They're not mine," he said softly. "I'm just remembering them for someone else." For the first time in my career, I felt the urge to close the file and walk away from a patient. Not because I didn't understand, but because I feared that if I stayed, I might. The first incident happened on a Tuesday. An EKG machine in the cardiac ward short-circuited without warning, sending sparks into the darkness during a power lull. The maintenance team found no fault in the wiring, no logical cause. By Thursday, 2 nurses had reported receiving phone calls on the ward's landline from an anonymous male voice. The calls came at times when no incoming lines were recorded in the hospital log. On Friday morning, I overheard 2 orderlies whispering about their dreams, vivid, unsettling visions that began only after working a night shift near Daniel's room. They used phrases I'd heard before, almost word for word from Daniel's first conversation with me. That afternoon, I found one of the nurses collapsed in the corridor outside the psychiatric ward. She was conscious, but trembling, her lips repeating the same phrase Daniel had whispered to me days ago, "The door is open." Something inside me shifted then. Professional detachment, that shield we cling to in medicine, began to fracture. This wasn't just a patient anymore. This was something that had entered the walls, the staff, perhaps even me. Late that night, I sat in my office, dictating my case notes. The building was silent except for the distant hum of ventilation. I paused mid-sentence when I heard it, a voice, low and deliberate, speaking my name from somewhere inside the room. "Dr. Beck." It was Daniel's voice. I froze, staring at the darkened doorway. The psychiatric ward was 4 floors below. "Daniel," I called, my voice barely more than a whisper. No answer. Only the faint echo of my own pulse in my ears. I bolted from my chair, my steps quick and unsteady toward the elevators. By the time I reached his room, he was awake, sitting upright, eyes bright with an almost childlike amusement. "Now," he said, smiling faintly, "you're listening." I stood there, breathless, unsure if I had just experienced my first hallucination or my first message. Elias began to speak that evening with a clarity that startled me. The pauses were gone. His eyes, usually vacant, locked onto mine as if he had been waiting for the exact moment when I would be unable to turn away. He didn't talk about his life. Not the one here in this hospital in this century. Instead, he spoke of a fire that consumed a theater in Vienna in 1881. He described the layout of the building, the way the smoke gathered against the gilded ceilings, the screams that were muffled by collapsing beams. He named the exact number of people who died. Later I would search and find that every detail was correct. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. Or maybe he had read about it somewhere. But then came more. He spoke of a flood in the city of Saint-Pierre in Martinique, 1902, before it was destroyed by Mount Pelee. He told me the names of children who had drowned in alleyways, children who were never found. Again, I checked. Again, it was true. Each story came with a strange detachment, as though he were merely a custodian of these memories, not a participant. And yet, he spoke of carrying them, a word he repeated often. "I carry them," he said, his voice almost reverent. "Who?" I asked. "The ones who can't leave yet." I tried steering the conversation toward his own identity, his own supposed crimes. But he never confessed to harming anyone. Instead, he painted himself as something else. Not a savior, not a killer, but a witness. Someone assigned to be present when life slipped away. Assigned by whom? He never said. There was a moment, fleeting but sharp, when I considered the possibility that what I was hearing wasn't delusion. That maybe this man possessed knowledge that defied explanation. But training, years of rationality, demanded I resist that thought. The alternative was too dangerous. Still, something gnawed at me. If these were fabrications, they were perfect in their precision, their historical accuracy. And if they weren't? That night, after our session, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his voice, the way it lowered when he said, "You wouldn't understand the weight," as if the words were meant for someone else entirely. On the night before Elias was scheduled for transfer to a high-security psychiatric unit, I decided to hold one last session. Not for his sake, for mine. The room felt heavier than usual, the air thick. Elias sat calmly, his wrists cuffed to the arms of his chair, eyes fixed not on me, but on something behind me. I resisted the urge to turn. I began with the usual, asking how he felt, if he understood where he was going. He nodded once, as though indulging me. Then he leaned forward, pulling the chain of his restraints taut. "You wake up at 3:17 every morning," he said. "Not because of nightmares, but because that's when your father used to come home drunk. You've forgotten the sound of his keys at the door, but your body hasn't." I froze. It was a truth so private, so buried, that even I had stopped consciously recalling it. "How do you know that?" My voice was sharper than I intended. His lips curled into something between a smile and pity. "Because I was there." Before I could press him, a monitor beeped, then screamed. Elias' heart rate spiked, then flatlined. Staff flooded in. I stepped back, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. And then, silence. The bed was empty. The restraints were still locked, unbroken, lying flat against the mattress. Security was called. We combed the hospital for hours. The cameras showed nothing unusual, just a burst of static on every feed for exactly 12 seconds. When the image returned, the bed was empty. Officially, the report read, "Patient absconded under unknown circumstances." Unofficially, no one had any explanation. I remained in the room long after everyone else had gone. The bed looked wrong without him, too neat, too still. And in that stillness, I felt something impossible to name. I don't know if Elias Crane was sick, dangerous, or simply a master manipulator. But sometimes in the quiet hours before dawn, I feel it again, that strange weight in the air. And I remember his final words. "Because I was there." And God help me, a part of me believes him.